Well, good morning, and welcome to Radcliffe Day 2017. And welcome to a lovely spring day in New England. I'm Liz Cohen. I'm Dean of the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study. I'm a professor of American history here at Harvard. And like many of you, I am an avid and concerned consumer of the news. I am also a longtime admirer of Gwen Ifill and Judy Woodruff, whom we will honor with Radcliffe medals at today's lunch. By tradition and by design, this morning panel is devoted to a topic that is close to the heads and hearts of our honorees, often highlighting challenges in the area in which they have excelled. Today's exploration of untruths and their consequences will help us appreciate Gwen and Judy's commitment to integrity in journalism all the more. Over a year ago, we decided to focus this Radcliffe Day on the changing media landscape and to celebrate the best of journalism. When we began planning, the phrase alternative facts was still an oxymoron and not yet a fact of our existence. Fake news was a fringe phenomenon. And the Oxford English Dictionary had not yet designated post-truth as its word of the year for 2016. Who then could imagine a president of the United States accusing the mainstream media of purveying fake news and in a tweet calling the free press the enemy of the American people? Presidents have long been annoyed, even angered, by journalists, but they have not depicted freedom of the press as a threat to the very nation that enshrines that ideal in its Constitution. Meanwhile, we are experiencing equally dramatic changes in the ways that we encounter the news. A proliferation of media sources, including Facebook, clickbait, tweets, retweets, and memes, has infiltrated the news landscape. The dizzying number and speed of new media challenge the notion of authority, dismantle longstanding methods of quality control, and fragment American audiences into narrow and often ideologically defined market segments. Tried and true media like television news frequently use similar divide and conquer tactics. Networks know that there are large potential audiences on the left and the right and across all educational levels and income brackets who want their biases confirmed, not challenged by uncomfortable or inconvenient facts. So instead of sober and meticulous reporting, we see panels of partisans who substitute loudness of shouting for depth of analysis. Simplified messages might entertain viewers and boost ratings, but they do not provide the illuminating inquiry that an informed electorate requires. And yet, with all the pandering, a large proportion of the American public still claims to deeply distrust the media and the information it conveys. That distrust should worry us all. Whether the topic is the fate of Obamacare, relations with Russia, or climate change, only a well-informed citizenry with a genuine understanding of the issues at stake can weigh opposing views and make smart and fair decisions with full appreciation of the trade-offs involved. A healthy, trusted news media matters to all of us who care about making the United States the robust, deliberative democracy it has long aspired to be. How can we hope to live up to those aspirations with an embattled First Amendment, a besieged media, and an electorate wandering in the wilderness, unable to distinguish between truths and untruths. We are here today to probe how we got here, but perhaps even more important, to ask what we can do about it. We should also ask how journalism and journalists can respond to these challenges. I am cheered, for example, that in the face of the turmoil of the last 4 months, and particularly over the astonishing last few weeks, there have been journalists who have remained undeterred and even more determined to fulfill the press's constitutional responsibility to pursue the truth wherever it may take us. One of the ways that we tackle big questions like these at the Radcliffe Institute is by assembling stellar groups of individuals to share experiences and expertise. We do so all year long with lectures, conferences, and seminars, and today is no exception. As an Institute for Advanced Study, we know that deep research and informed analysis do matter, and we value debate among different perspectives as a way to move deliberation forward. This morning's discussion brings together some of today's best minds, liberal and conservative, from the classroom and the newsroom, to help us think through an issue that surely stands among the most important challenges our society faces at this moment. To guide our conversation today, we are fortunate to have my Harvard colleague, Anne-Marie Lipinski, as our moderator. Anne-Marie has won a Pulitzer for her own investigative journalism and has gone on to award Pulitzers to others, first as a member and then as co-chair of the Pulitzer Prize Board. Anne-Marie is currently the curator of the Nieman Foundation at Harvard, and in her 6 years on campus, she has made the Nieman program an integral part of Harvard's academic life. In planning this year's Radcliffe Day on the topic of integrity in journalism, I have benefited enormously from Anne-Marie's insight and her generosity. She has been with me every step of the way, so I am delighted to have her here today to introduce our panelists and to moderate the discussion. But before we dive into our panel discussion, we have a special treat. As you know, this afternoon we will honor Gwen Ifill and Judy Woodruff. Someone who has worked closely with both of them is David Brooks, columnist at the New York Times and frequent guest on the PBS NewsHour. Whatever the medium, David always enlightens us with his own unique angle on concerns of the moment. David has to be in Washington, D.C. this afternoon. He's actually going to hold the fort at the PBS NewsHour, so he will not be able to stay for the lunch program. But he did not want this day to go by without adding his own tribute to Gwen and to Judy. So when David finishes his reflections, Anne-Marie will introduce the panelists and we will begin our discussion. Please join me now in welcoming David to the podium.
Thank you. I thought I'd try to impress my boss by showing up to work today. Now, you should know I teach at Yale, and so I'll be brief. I know you Harvard people didn't come here to hear me speak. You came here to hear yourself speak. And so I will try to get out of the way of that. I have a unique specialty. I go on public broadcasting and I debate Catholics from Massachusetts. One of them on NPR is E.J. Dionne, who's sitting over there somewhere. And then I do a segment on the NewsHour with Mark Shields. Our segment is called Shields and Brooks. It should have been called Brooke Shields, but that would have been better. My line about Mark is he's been doing it for a little while. The segment is now Shields and Brooks. Before that, it was Shields and Shigo. Before that, it was Shields and Gergen. And before that, it was Shields and Coolidge, I think. It started out at Shields and Thomas Aquinas, I think it was a while ago. And we do have a just a very good time. We have the show always lightens my spirit and informs me and makes me feel a little better about America because of that show. Our audience skews a little on the senior side. When a 93-year-old lady comes up to me in the airport, I know what she's going to say. It's, "I don't watch your show, but my mother loves it." So I'll just give a few quick remarks about Gwen and Judy. I have a group that I meet with on Thursdays. I have dinner with every Thursday night in D.C. I've written a column about them. And they're a bunch of kids from D.C., almost all African-American kids, 18 to 22. And they've had rough backgrounds, and they all come to this home where they can stay and where they can get food. And we meet there every Thursday. And we've been doing it for about 3 years, and they're just on the cusp of life. And what we give them is we adults sit there and let them show their talents to us and find themselves in that way. We provide them for an audience. What they give to us is a complete intolerance of social distance. So I walk into this thing, the first time I went there 3 years ago, and I met a kid, and his name was Ed, and I reached out to shake his hand, and he just said, "We don't really shake hands here, we hug here." And he sort of embraced me in a hug, and we've been hanging all over each other ever since. So I was there last night with these kids, and it was just such a pleasure to use time over dinner to talk about Gwen and Judy, and to tell sort of that generation a few things about how one can conduct one's life. And when I agreed to do this, I thought Gwen would be here, and I was going to give her a lot more crap than I'll be able to today. But one of the things I described to them was on the day Gwen died and Judy called with the news, I went through my emails, and I just looked at all the emails she'd sent me. And some of them were just check-in emails, "How you doing?" Or giving me some business about a column I'd written. But a surprising number were surprisingly tough, like, "You need to learn to communicate better." Or there were things that I had let down the show. And her toughness is one of the things that leaps out at me. Toughness and tenacity, a tenacity we saw all through the conventions as she continued doing her work when she was much sicker than I at least knew. And so she's at the end of the spectrum on toughness and resilience. But she's also on the end of the spectrum on kindness. And it's that odd combination of those two things, extremely incandescent around people, at the same time toughness on behalf of craft. The love of people was at the extreme, the dedication to craft, the humility before God. And so the thing I wanted to talk to my kids about was just what it is a vocation. Because I think if there's one thing that Judy and Gwen represent, it's that quality of having a vocation and dedication to vocation. Friedrich Buechner, the novelist, once wrote that a vocation is where your deep gladness meets the world's deepest need. And it's the marriage of those two things. A career is something you choose and you do as long as it's paying off for you, but a vocation you're sort of summoned to. The great example is Viktor Frankl was a psychologist in Austria in the 30s. He was put in Auschwitz, and he said, we often tell people, "What do you want from life?" And he said, that's the wrong question. The right question is, what is life asking of you? And I would say for Gwen and Judy, life, and especially this year, has asked them, and asked Judy now, to be an anchor of a certain sort of news organization, which I'll describe in a minute, but which is a certain sort of old-fashioned news organization. A vocation requires a talent, which Gwen and Judy have had. It reveals itself through a pleasure. When you found your vocation, you get intrinsic pleasure out of doing those things. And most of all, it expresses itself through a consistency of commitment over time. A commitment is falling in love with something and then building a structure of behavior around it for those moments when love falters. And so when I think about the NewsHour, and especially Gwen's commitment to it and now Judy's, what I think about is consistency over time and permanence. When I think of Judy, I think of her writing notes furiously before a segment, through the afternoon, and through the mornings. Judy's been in this business a while, and it would be easy to coast. Television is an industry in which coasting is supremely easy and supremely alluring. And yet I've never seen her come anything less than 300% prepared for any segment we've been doing. And so it is that consistency and permanence over time that I think is what's so emblematic and is what I so much wanted to talk to my kids about. And then permanence and consistency in what we do. The NewsHour is not just a program, it's an institution. And those of us who come to work there, it was there before we came, and I hope and pray it'll be there long after we're gone. And when you come to the NewsHour, you come and try to inhabit certain standards of behavior. For the first 10 years I did it, the host was Jim Lehrer. And when I would say something good on the program, his eyes would crinkle with a little pleasure. And when I said something bad, his mouth would turn down in a little displeasure. And so I learned how to do this business by trying to avoid the mouth turn down and get the eye crinkle. And so there's certain standards that no one even has to express that are inherent in walking in the place. And Jim and Robin started it, Gwen and Judy have continued it, and I think we all have a sensation now that somehow the NewsHour has found its moment in this year. Not only in the ratings, which we don't care about, but in the value of doing the permanent, long-standing, traditional things in an era where impermanence and attention deficit are becoming the norm. And so something stable and solid and permanent and old-fashioned and counter-cultural somehow becomes a pillar in a moment when a lot of pillars are being washed away. And so basically I just talked to the kids about all these things, about permanence, about institutions, about vocations, about the love of people. And then just to round it off, I took out my phone and I took out a big picture of Gwen on my phone. And after Gwen died, when people were eulogizing her, the one thing every eulogy and every obituary had was about the quality of her smile. And the words were incandescent, luminescent, lit from within. And I don't know what creates that kind of incandescence and luminescence, but taking pleasure in the small things and in the people, combined with that ferocious dedication to the integrity of craft, was, I think, what marked her and which marks the program today, which I think a lot of us are so proud to be in the same country with. Thank you.
Many thanks to David Brooks for those comments and also for the work that he and Judy and Gwen have so thoughtfully done for so long on the NewsHour. I think you'd all agree that together they offered us some of the smartest political analysis of the recent election season and post-election season, and I am abundantly grateful for him and for that. Okay, enough about the guy from Yale. I am so honored to be here today, and especially want to thank Dean Cohen for including me in this very, very important conversation, and also to thank her for her prescience. If anything, her notion to honor Judy and Gwen and explore the theme of untruths and their consequences is more urgent and relevant and smarter today than when she first broached it a year ago. So we all owe her a lot of gratitude for even conceiving of this idea. It seemed like an issue at the time, but boy, is it an issue now. So thank you so much for that. And as President Faust very recently reminded our fellows at the Nieman Foundation for Journalism, in a so-called post-truth environment, the issues bearing on the media are precisely those faced by the academy, certainly here at Harvard, where the motto is Veritas. So I think that what we'll be dealing with today, both celebrating and concerned about, has such direct ties to what we do here every day. It is no exaggeration to say that for many in my industry, Gwen and Judy are heroes. Two women who joined forces to create a sort of journalistic true north. Through their work individually and together, they have not only personified our highest values, but defined them. In what has been a remarkably challenging year, the News Hour has offered us everything we ask of journalism done right. On a personal note, I would also like to publicly acknowledge my great debt to Gwen, who was on the search committee that brought me to Harvard. So I am very, very grateful to her. We are so privileged to have four extraordinary panelists with us this morning to try and help us make sense of this interesting and complicated time. They offer a diversity of experience and perspective, which we will hear reflected in their remarks. A little bit about format. I will do brief introductions of them all next, and then we'll hear from each of them to make some brief opening comments, and then we will convene a conversation about these issues and also invite questions from the audience, which somewhere there are pieces of paper going around, cards, and you can submit those to people gathering those, and we will try to integrate as many of those as we can into the conversation. First is Danielle Allen, director of Harvard's Edmond J. Safra Center for Ethics and a political theorist who has published broadly on democratic theory and the history of political thought. Danielle's books include a recent and widely read re-examination of the Declaration of Independence, and she is also a contributing columnist to the Washington Post, where she wrote regularly about the election. Jonah Goldberg is the senior editor of the National Review and author of a broadly published syndicated column, weekly columnist for the Los Angeles Times, and contributor to USA Today and to Fox News. He is the author of Liberal Fascism, The Secret History of the American Left, and The Tyranny of Clichés, How Liberals Cheat in the War of Ideas. Alelia Bundles is a journalist and author working on her fourth book, a biography of her great-grandmother. She served as a news executive at both NBC and ABC, including as a deputy bureau chief in Washington. She chairs the board of the National Archives Foundation and serves on the Schlesinger Library Council here at the Radcliffe Institute. And E.J. Dionne, who is a columnist for the Washington Post and a senior fellow at the Brookings Institute. He appears regularly on ABC's This Week, on MSNBC, and of course on National Public Radio, where we hear him frequently in debate with David Brooks. He is the author. You get the last word today, E.J.
Yeah. For once.
He is the author of 6 books, including Why the Right Went Wrong, Conservatism from Goldwater to the Tea Party and Beyond. We will start with...
We've been through it before. Sorry.
We will start with Danielle.
Thank you, Anne-Marie. Good morning. Oh, you can do better than that. Good morning.
Good morning.
Thank you. It is such an honor to be here in celebration of Gwen Ifill and to be here with my distinguished fellow panelists. And I was worried about being cold out here, but I already have begun to feel the warmth in David's remarks and in the assembly of people here. So it's a pleasure to be with you. I did, as Anne-Marie said, spend much of last year working as a columnist for the Washington Post, writing about the election, thinking about the American people and thinking about what's becoming of us. But the truth of the matter is that I'm a historian first. And so in moments of complexity and difficulty, the first thing I do is look to historical examples to try to contextualize. This is not the first difficult moment this country has lived through by any stretch of the imagination. We could spend any number of sort of hours talking about the Civil War, the most extreme example of our difficulty, but we don't need to look that far back, of course. You'll hear some about Watergate this morning, I think, from some of my fellow panelists. And I want to go back just a little bit before the hardest part of McCarthyism to the late 1930s, when Father Coughlin's radio show was sweeping up millions of listeners. Initially, he focused on a sort of pro-Roosevelt agenda, but he turned at a certain point to being, in effect, an advocate for Hitler and producing a lot of anti-Semitic radio broadcasts, and was seen as generally, in a dangerous way, spurring problematic populism. He was a supporter of Huey Long, for instance. So there was an organization that sprang up in 1937, funded by Filene of Filene's basement department stores, called the Institute of Propaganda Analysis. And this was an organization that was, in some sense, trying to answer exactly the question we're all here today trying to answer. What do you do with fake news? What do you do when people are swayed by fictions, by lies, and so forth? And they worked for 5 years, developing lessons, disseminating them in schools, teaching people how to identify the marks of propaganda. So they had a list of items that they asked people to pay attention to. But I wanted to share a little bit more about some of the specifics of what they were trying to do, because I think it could be helpful for ourselves as we try to think our way through this moment. So first of all, I just wanted to share with you their analysis of the challenge of the media in their day and age. It sounds very similar to the kinds of complaints that we have. They're concerned about the common man being swept up, having all kinds of anxiety because of the Depression, of course, and the combination of changes in the agricultural and rural areas and urban areas. And then they're worried about the people who are able to take advantage of this anxiety. And they wrote, as a rule, spokesmen for these groups are not concerned with the ethics of the means by which they use to get the common man to make up his mind. They are concerned only with getting him to make up his mind in unquestioning agreement with them. And to get him to do this, they employ all the subtleties, all the knowledge of human psychology, which is the modern world's heritage. Their persuasive appeals are geared to the century's streamlined channels of communication: the newspaper, the radio, the motion picture, skywriting, blazing neon and electric signs, and innumerable other media. In other words, skywriting was their Twitter. Okay? So that's how we may sound 50 years from now in regard to the hysteria, in some sense, that we often express about the media. So the problem is not necessarily the channels of communication, it's something else. From their point of view, the problem was specifically whether or not we were cultivating critical intelligence as educators and as a nation. And so they built a series of programs that had two purposes. One was to re-engage adults in what they called free discussion, to return to communal conversation rather than mass communication as a way of trying to revive independent thinking, or as they called it, the free play of intelligence. The second thing they did was to focus on the scientific method. And here's where I think they got something right, but also something wrong. So they wrote as one of their goals that they wanted to achieve an understanding and a working knowledge of the scientific method through day-to-day individual and group practice in asking such questions as, are our premises supported by the evidence? And do our conclusions follow from our premises? They focused a lot on facts, on getting people to clean up their use of facts, and they used the techniques of the scientific method to support this. And so, for example, just to give you one more quotation about their focus on facts, they said this about their goal: education, the development of the ability to make judgments independently, has its roots in the gathering and classification of pertinent facts bearing upon the problem or question, in the arranging and organizing of these facts in order that a tentative solution may be suggested. So facts, facts, facts. And they're right. We need to do work on re-educating people in the scientific method and the use of evidence, especially young people. But where are values in that formulation? My own view is that a lot of the difficulties we currently face have to do with our inability to talk about some core American and shared values. There are two that I believe are married to each other fundamentally: liberty and equality. And from my point of view, conservatives don't do a good job talking about equality, and liberals do a terrible job talking about freedom. And so as we work on cleaning up our facts, I believe we also need to work on cleaning up our capacity to think about the abstract ideals that in fact give democracy its meaning. If you ask somebody what a monarchy is, you point to the picture of a king. You ask somebody what a democracy is, there's no picture to point to. There's what we do together through conversation in order to make liberty and equality real. Now, what on earth does that mean? We have to rebuild our understanding of that, which I think we can do only conversationally. And I think that's as important as the work we need to do on facts. Thank you.
Thank you, Danielle. Jonah?
First of all, I know we got a really crammed schedule, but I want to say what a real honor and treat it is for me to be here, and it's a wonderful event. But I also only have a few minutes, so as Henry VIII said to each of his wives, I won't keep you long. Where to begin? Yes, I'm a journalist, but I should make it very clear. I'm a conservative opinion journalist who works for a magazine called National Review, and we've always seen ourselves, in the tradition of Bill Buckley, as trying to be the policeman of the right. Sometimes we don't do it as well as we should, and sometimes we certainly don't do it the way people like EJ would like us to do it, but we take the mission seriously. And one of the most disappointing and painful things of these last 2 years for me, I've spent my time on Amazon searching for deals on hemlock, is the degree to which I've heard from enormous numbers of people, longtime fans of my writing and or of National Review, who were disappointed in me that I didn't live down to their expectations. And by that I mean I could not bring myself to support Donald Trump in the primaries or in the general election, and the basic argument I made is that conservatism I love, that I grew up with, and I've been doing this for a very long time. I mean, I literally met Pat Buchanan at my bris. Boils down to just simply, and I think that actually explains some of Pat's views on the Jews, too. These people are barbarians. Look what, anyway. Conservatism has lots of definitions, and I can quote lots of them, but at the end of the day, at the meta level, it boils down to just two things: the idea that character matters and the idea that ideas matter. And you can have big debates about what you mean by character, how you should define character, what's good character, what's bad character, and you can have a big argument about what ideas matter. But that's it. And when I say ideas matter, and I very much agree with Danielle about this, that is about the importance of argument, about reason, about marshaling facts and logic to your side to make an argument, because that's what democracy is about. It's about arguments. Democracy is not about agreement. Democracy is about disagreement and the ability to voice disagreement both at the polling station but also in the public realm. And my problem with Donald Trump was always that he stands athwart both the importance of ideas, which he has, occasionally he walks through their zip code, but and I've yet, after 2 years now of asking this question, I've asked people to come up with a definition of good character that he can meet. And it doesn't have to be about sexuality or any of that stuff. It could be about business practices or honesty or self-restraint. I mean, you can pick up any version, any definition you want, I'm open to, and no one's been able to make the case. And so therefore, and this gets to the point of what I think is really important in journalism. I actually believe that opinion journalism is among the best forms of journalism, because opinion journalism you're actually making an argument. It's very much like advocates in a court of law. We all know that the prosecution is biased towards conviction. And we all know that the defense attorney is biased towards acquittal. But there are certain rules of the court that you have to deal with. You have to deal with the facts. You have to address the other side's best arguments, not their worst ones, or you'll lose. And you have to tell the truth. And that's how I think democracy advances, is by making those arguments. And one of the reasons why I love opinion journalism is you get to tell the reader where you're coming from. And you say, this is the argument I want to make. Yeah, I'm a conservative or I'm a liberal, it doesn't really matter, but this is where I'm coming from, and you can always tell the best opinion journalism, whether it's on the right or the left, in the New Yorker or the Nation or the National Review, the Weekly Standard, by how well the writer characterizes the other side's best arguments. And I think that is where an enormous amount of important work for democracy is done through journalism is there. I mean, reporting is all great and important, and I'm not trying to diminish it, but where a democracy has its arguments is through opinion journalism, through the higher end of opinion journalism, not the barking shout shows on late night cable news or any of that kind of stuff. And so now I guess I should very quickly note that there are a lot of people out there, many I suspect might be in this room, who seem to think, who've sort of walked into the movie of American politics and seen Donald Trump and yelled, "Where did this monster come from?" And they act as if they've walked into the last 5 minutes of the movie. This stuff has been building for a very long time. The idea that mainstream media, that Democratic Party, that liberals are utterly blameless in the problems that have arisen, I think may be very reassuring to certain people, but you're not going to get to the heart of the problem unless you address it. And the mainstream media did not lose its credibility during the Republican primaries. The mainstream media did not lose half the country, essentially, because Donald Trump persuaded them to. Donald Trump took advantage and exploited that. Donald Trump is sort of a classic populist. One of my favorite lines comes from William Jennings Bryan, where he says, "The people of Nebraska are for free silver, therefore I am for free silver. I will look up the arguments later." And again, as a conservative who believes in the importance of ideas and arguments, I actually believe you should make the case for free silver if you actually believe the case for free silver. And one of the things that has driven me crazy is how many of my colleagues on the right think that they have to speak for their base rather than speak what they believe to be true. And it's astounding to me how many times when the little light on the top of the camera goes off, people who have been defending Donald Trump will turn to me and say, "Oh, I can't believe I have to defend this guy." And I think about 90% of journalistic ethics is a bunch of self-indulgent guild mentality. But one of the things I actually truly and passionately believe in, and I think it solves most journalistic ethical problems, is don't lie. You know, if you believe something isn't true, you shouldn't say or write that it's true. It's not the most complicated thing in the world. And so what I so dismay about the Trumpian moment is how corrupting it has been to the right, where, you know, it seems to me fairly obvious that you should condemn someone for beating up a journalist for asking about a CBO score. And yet, yesterday, Twitter and all sorts of other places lit up with defenses of this, that, oh, this reporter asked for it. And I can't get my head around it. And I find it utterly dismaying. But I should also, anyways, to get back to the point at hand, the credibility of the mainstream media, I mean, we hear a lot about fake news. I know we're going to talk a lot about fake news. But you guys do realize that Jon Stewart ran a TV show called The Daily Show, which was lionized across the mainstream media, won a Peabody Award for its journalism, was the #1 source of news for millennials throughout the last decade. And it is literally, not figuratively the way Joe Biden uses literally, literally a fake news program. And there wasn't a lot of outrage or embarrassment about it. I think in part because it was really funny and very well produced. But there have been a lot of things that have undermined the credibility of the mainstream media for a very long time with a lot of people who don't necessarily agree with a lot of its assumptions. And to all of a sudden walk into the situation that we're in now, by all means, use Donald Trump as a piñata, but he's not the author of any of these problems. He's a symptom of them. And I'll just close by saying, we live in an idiot culture. And what I mean by idiot culture is not we're all morons, although they're well represented at large. Idiot comes from the ancient Greek, and it means someone who didn't have sufficient knowledge to be a good citizen. The words idiosyncratic and all the other words with those roots that have the same root meant someone who was alienated and deracinated or disconnected from the greater good and from the public polity, and that they didn't have the wherewithal or knowledge to be a good citizen. And this is a problem we have in our society. It has nothing to do with right wing versus left wing. It has to do with how we're raising people. It has to do with the kind of citizens that we're producing. The original idea of the liberal arts wasn't an idea about making people liberal. It was about giving people the tools and requirements and sets of knowledge to make them good citizens. And this country is falling down on that job. And it's very hard. I mean, NewsHour is a fantastic program, but it's very difficult to sustain something like that when there isn't a market for it. And we have to figure out how to better train young people to want good news and good journalism, because as it stands right now, a lot of them don't. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Jonah. Alelia?
Thank you, Anne Marie. So I was so honored last summer when Liz Cohen sent me a note and said that Gwen had asked that I be on the panel. And that's because Gwen knew how much I love Radcliffe, and I'm class of 74. And one of the last presidents of the Radcliffe College Alumni Association. So Gwen and I, our paths didn't cross when we overlapped for a year as part of that first big post-1968, post-Martin Luther King Jr. assassination and long overdue initiative to recruit black students to New England colleges and prep schools. But our lives eventually intersected in many concentric circles through mutual friends, through journalism, and like many black reporters, Jesse Jackson's 1984 campaign. What I hope I can bring to today's conversation is a sense of the constancy and consistency and depth of Gwen's integrity. She remained solid, grounded, decent, and generous, whether she was moderating a town hall or sitting on her back porch with her girlfriends. I believe that journalists earn trust by the way we live our lives. The same goes for elected officials. At our best, we live by the adage, comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable. As a reporter, Gwen kept her tools sharpened. Curiosity, skepticism, but never cynicism, accuracy, respect for others, empathy for those who felt misunderstood, encouragement for the young people she mentored, impatience with those who did less than their best, and no mercy for those who lied and made excuses. She was unimpressed by shiny things. In a story too long to tell this morning, I remember when she was being recruited by another network for a show with higher visibility, and I assume substantially more money than she was making at the NewsHour. But after much toing and froing, she withdrew her name. She chose substance over shininess. She knew she would be judged and measured, just as all television reporters and anchors are judged and measured, and expected to be the shiny new thing who could rescue the ratings. But over time, she had been intentional about developing a pact with her audience to be authentic, to shed light rather than to generate heat. I think she sensed that this pact she had developed would have less currency in the new environment. And yet, to see her on the Sunday morning shows on Meet the Press and This Week and Face the Nation was a joy to behold. She always brought her A game. There was no question that she was equal to the task. Gwen's annual New Year's Day party was legendary, and in many ways, a metaphor for her life. Her capacity for love and friendship and collegiality was expansive and encompassing. Some years later, after the first set of parties, when she moved to a new house, which looked a lot like the old house on steroids, bigger with the same floor plan, it seemed as if she had done so to accommodate the expanding circle of friends and colleagues and ideas. Jonah. At the end of the party, I have to admit, I was always one of the stragglers, one of the extended circle of girlfriends who gathered in the living room. Gwen was our friend whom Queen Latifah had played on Saturday Night Live. Our champion who had stumped Dick Cheney and John Edwards on a question they should have been able to answer. But Gwen was Gwen, always, always. Gwen never became an anchor monster, the term some of us who spend our lives as producers use for people who scream and throw tantrums when the red light on the camera goes off. In 2017, it should not be necessary to say that a social gathering like Gwen's annual party was remarkable and unusual in its diversity. In 2017, it should not be noteworthy that a social gathering with people of different races, ethnicities, backgrounds, beliefs, party affiliations, and ideologies is a rarity. But people whose paths crossed at Gwen's would not have met each other but for her. And in a politically polarized nation, that matters. The sensibilities she developed as a preacher's kid who often was the new face, as the daughter of immigrants, as a black girl in mostly white settings, as a political reporter when the bus was mostly boys, found their way into her work as the host of Washington Week and every job she held. There's so much more I want to say, but time is short. There is not enough time to talk about how Gwen handled bigotry and racism and straight-up ignorance with grace, how she deflected and smacked down the trolls who found her on Twitter. When we talk about untruths and consequences as we are today, I think one could argue that a failure on the part of journalists, news executives, publishers, elected officials, and people who knew better to more forcefully confront the lies about Barack Obama's birthplace and birth certificate changed the course of history. The brand of lies that we are hearing now and the liars who purvey them are immune to our outrage. We have crossed the threshold when public figures lie with the confidence that it does not matter that the lie can be exposed right after the commercial break when the file footage is queued up. But there is a glimmer of hope. Liars get cocky, liars miscalculate, lies backfire, lies have unintended consequences. As Abraham Lincoln said, you can fool all of the people some of the time and some of the people all of the time, but you cannot fool all of the people all of the time. Though I will concede that in a nation where we still are debating the causes and consequences of the Civil War, one can take nothing for granted and must be ever vigilant. But we owe it to Gwen to keep insisting on the truth. I leave you with Gwen's words. We can't expect the world to get better by itself. We have to create something we can leave the next generation. And with love and respect for my friend Gwen, I say that when we hear a lie, we must challenge it.
Thank you, Aurelia. EJ, you're up.
The definition of life being unfair is to have to speak after all these eloquent people. I just want to say, I want to pay tribute to three people. One is Drew Faust, who's sitting in the audience in front of us. Drew was generous enough to leave the perfect job, which was starting and running the Radcliffe Institute, to lead this great university. And if Drew doesn't mind my invoking Richard Nixon's slogan, "We need your intellectual leadership now more than ever." So thank you. I also, there have been all the tributes to Gwen, and I agree with every word, and that was so beautiful. And there's, her wisdom, her toughness, her intelligence. The thing I want to underscore is something you said, which is her role as a preacher's kid. And Gwen's family was actually foundational for the AME Church in the United States. And I think one of the things that we will most miss about Gwen is that profound, persistent, stubborn moral sense that she brought to every aspect of her life. Her church was the NewsHour, and her congregation remains faithful. Secondly, I want to pay tribute to Judy Woodruff. Everybody knows... Everybody knows how brilliant she is, what an extraordinary journalist she is. I think what matters more, I once said of someone, it showed me what I thought of journalism. This person's really, this person's a journalist and is really moral. And then I thought to myself, what does that tell you about what you think of journalists? And Judy is just one of the most warm-hearted, thoughtful, other-directed, welcoming people I have ever met. Now, as David Brooks pointed out, I am Catholic, so I feel guilt easily and deeply. And I got to say, whenever I see Judy and I reflect on her goodness and decency, I feel even more guilty. And I just do not understand how someone can make me feel so good about life and so guilty at the same time. I love you, Judy Woodruff. I also want to pay tribute to my sister Lucianne, a Navy JAG veteran who is in the audience, who would have killed me if I had not paid tribute to two people she so deeply admires, Judy and Gwen. I was wondering, listening, if this panel should be relabeled Alternative Veritas, because that's sort of where we seem to be going. And I want to say that it is really good to be with Jonah. I confess to a soft spot for Jonah. I met Jonah, I think, when he was 22 years old, starting out in journalism in Washington. And I recently quoted Jonah in my column, and I agreed with him, which shows the times we are in. It was a debate in the National Review about nationalism versus patriotism, and I agreed with Jonah that there was a difference and that we should prefer patriotism. But after I wrote that, I didn't know who should feel worse about this, Jonah or me. I mean, praise from a liberal fascist could make him guilty by association. And watching him get all this applause, I am now predicting the headline in Breitbart: phony conservative sellout wins applause from Harvard Radcliffe liberals.
The sad part is that's not a bold bet.
So I'm worried about the Radcliffe Institute ruining Jonah's career, but there's a lot of room on the liberal fascist side, and we would welcome you. I just want to make a couple of points. One of my favorite memos from an editor was a one-line memo from an AP editor that read, "Avoid cliches like the plague." What I was contemplating today and what to talk about, the cliche that came to mind, it's a great line in the original, but it's become a cliche. This is the best of times, this is the worst of times. And I think when we think about journalism right now, that is exactly correct about where we are right now. This is the best of times in the sense that I don't think Americans have as fully appreciated the role of independent journalism as they do now. That is to say, a significant group of Americans. And I think that as we see the investigative work being done, this amazing competition among newspapers, they're starting to make movies again about journalism where the journalists are not played by the people in the bar scene in Star Wars. I mean, This is an extraordinary moment. So I think there is an appreciation for the role of journalism that we haven't seen in a long time. And yet, there is great division over the role of journalism. And I think that it is genuinely disturbing. What's even more disturbing than that candidate slugged out a reporter who asked him a hard question is that the alibi used by the candidate that was widely accepted was it was okay to slug him because he was a liberal journalist. And that really tells us something about the divisions we face now. I'm not going to talk primarily about opinion journalism, but I passionately agree with something, God help me, Jonah said, because I think it's important to defend the role of opinion journalism, which is what I do. And there's the famous Patrick Moynihan line, people are entitled to their own opinions, they're not entitled to their own facts. But I think there should be a corollary, which is opinion journalism that is not based on fact is not journalism. And I do think I'm going to focus primarily on the rest of what I have to say on journalism broadly speaking, but I really do think we need a conversation in the world of opinion journalism because there is a real danger now, more than we have seen in the past, and I'm very anti-nostalgia, but more than we have seen in the past, that fact is getting lost more and more. The John F. Kennedy, whom David referenced, gave an extraordinary commencement speech at Yale. By the way, in that commencement speech, he said, when he got an honorary degree, I have the best of both worlds, a Harvard education and a Yale degree. But he also said something that I've recently gone through some old JFK speeches because his 100th birthday is on Monday, and he spoke of those who seek the comfort of opinion without the discomfort of thought. And I thought, what an extraordinary line for our moment. Cass Sunstein recently wrote a very interesting book on the new media world, and he cited John Stuart Mill's aspiration for debate in a democratic republic. It involved, Mill said, placing human beings in contact with persons dissimilar to themselves and with modes of thought and action unlike those with which we are familiar. And as Sunstein noted, we live in a time when it is far easier than ever, I think, partly because of the way we live and organize our lives. We tend to live more with people we agree with than we used to, partly because of technology. And I think it's important when we think about technology that technology makes everything more efficient, which includes both the spreading of truth and the spreading of lies. And the two can happen simultaneously. But more than that, we tend to live we can live in our own information worlds. And I just want to salute a study that was done by the Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society here at Harvard and MIT's Center for Civic Media. They studied 1.25 million stories studied online between April 1st, 2015 and Election Day. And they concluded that, first, this is a problem more on the right end of politics than on the left end of politics, and that liberals tend to consume a larger mix of media that includes old-fashioned media, whereas a significant group of conservatives consume primarily or almost entirely conservative media. Now, Jonah might argue that's because all the regular media are liberal, but I think that has actually led to some real problems on the right by rejecting any sources that aren't conservative on their face. This study concluded that a right-wing media network anchored around Breitbart developed as a distinct and insulated media system using social media as a backbone to transmit a hyper-partisan perspective to the world. This pro-Trump media sphere appears to have not only been successful in setting the agenda for the conservative media sphere, but also strongly influenced the broader media agenda, in particular coverage of Hillary Clinton. While concerns about political and media polarization online are long-standing, our study suggests that polarization was asymmetric. Pro-Clinton audiences were highly attentive to traditional media outlets, which continued to be the most prominent outlets across the public sphere. That's the good news. Along with more left-oriented online sites. But pro-Trump audiences paid the majority of their attention to polarized outlets that have developed recently, many of them only since the 2008 election. This study points to a central truth that we can't evade, that the problem presented by Trumpism is not the creation of broad general trends that have nothing to do with ideology. It is not the product of technology itself. The loss of a common conversation is the result in significant part of new habits on the political right, but they're habits ingrained since the 1960s. And the Harvard-MIT study underscored this by noting that technology alone cannot be held accountable, but that technology has enabled these developments. I won't go into the study more, but I think that one of the issues we should discuss is the asymmetric quality of this conversation, of this problem, but also the problems that might exist on my side of the ledger. I just want to close with two thoughts. One is from Václav Havel, who said that when a truth is not given complete freedom, freedom is not complete. And in his powerful essay on tyranny, the historian Timothy Snyder offered 20 lessons that the 20th century had to teach us at this moment. And lesson 10 was at once basic and essential: believe in truth. He wrote that to abandon facts is to abandon freedom. If nothing is true, then no one can criticize power. You submit to tyranny when you renounce the difference between what you want to hear and what is actually the case. Thank you.
Thank you, EJ. Oh my gosh, we have so much to talk about in so little time. There have been two references to it, but I want to go back to it, but for a slightly different reason. So we all woke up this morning to a headline, Gianforte wins congressional race one day after assaulting a reporter. And so putting aside the actual act, where I want to dwell is on the reporting of that. And we had a situation wherein there were eyewitnesses to the actual event, and the best eyewitnesses were from Fox News, it turned out, and the reporters gave a really clinical description of what had happened, and it was a description in complete variance with the description given by the then candidate's press spokesman. And Fox News, in its coverage of the event, gave much more time and favor to the press spokesman's description of the event than to their own reporters' accounts, which pretty much underscored the reporters' telling of the event, which was that he had been assaulted for asking a question. And so in this conversation we're having, and it's all, it's inspiring and it's lofty, don't lie, that will solve our problems, facts, 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 more attention to the scientific method. How do we get there when it seems that we have, it's going to be very hard to extract ourselves from this dishonest relationship we have with audiences at the moment, which may be good for ratings, but is very bad for democracy. I think that's an example of speaking to an audience and telling them what they might want to hear. That's a comforting version of what happened if you're of a certain political stripe, but it wasn't true. So how do we get from these ideals to actual, what's happening on the ground in television or elsewhere?
Well, can I just say, I think traditional media have been and continue to be deeply attentive to fact. I mean, I don't think it shocks us that Fox, although it's going through a kind of revolution right now, it's going to be interesting to see what Fox is 5 years from now compared to what it is today, but that Fox is primarily an opinion outlet that happens to have some real good, decent reporters working for it. And so I guess fair and balanced is the footage of the event on the one side and the statement by the Republican candidate about the event that people have just seen on the other. I think that part of the question is how people consume their news and whether they are even exposed to facts that they disagree with. Mark Zuckerberg spoke here yesterday, and the notion that we all get news, if fewer people go to the original source, whether the New York Times, the Washington Post, or any other outlet, or National Review for that matter, and they are more exposed to what their friends tell them, and that the system can be, or what they see on Facebook and Twitter, the system can be gamed in ways that people aren't even exposed to the alternative view or a challenge to a factually untrue statement. And I think that is one of the problems we face. On the other hand, I think all traditional media can do is to continually seek larger audiences and to insist over and over again that the facts matter and to apply that day to day in what they do. And I really do believe that my colleagues on the reporting side do exactly that.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Sure. So, I mean, I think the answer to your question has many parts, Anne-Marie. I think that's one of the reasons it's challenging. There's a part of the answer that's about, let's call it civic education in K through 12. And there's a part of the answer that's about how a massive business conglomerate like Fox News and sort of the Murdoch's News Corps changes course. I mean, it's just one example. There might be other examples we point to that perhaps we think should change course. And there are two very different questions. And so I think one of the challenges is always sort of figuring out where to focus one's energy. If one focuses on the K through 12 part of the conversation, it matters that one of the sort of most painful victims of our polarization has been social studies education. So I don't know how clear people are on that. But when the National Governors Association tried to develop the Common Core state standards, they aspired to have standards in three areas: math and science, English language arts, and social studies. And they achieved the first two of those. And whatever you think of the standards and of testing, it's the case that if you have them, you teach in those areas. And so there's been measurable, significant declines of time in school on social studies for the last 15 years. I mean, going back even before the Common Core state standards, so that No Child Left Behind. And the reason they didn't achieve the third standards was precisely because, as a society, we couldn't agree on how American history should be taught. Okay? Is it a triumphant story of the Americans continuously breaking through one frontier barrier after another and achieving greatness, or is it a story that is dragged down by the histories of slavery and genocide of Native Americans and so forth? There is a way to tell both parts of the story together. We have not found a way to do that politically. And so, paradoxically, I think, rebuilding civic education such that young people can have the tools to process the media, to be the kind of market for high-quality media that we need, actually requires the grown-ups, all of us, to be able to tell a shared history and recommit to standards in education in this area.
Yeah, I actually agree with all of that. Civilization is it's a verb. It's Hannah Arendt had this great line where she said, "Every generation, Western civilization is invaded by barbarians. We call them children." And the factory preset of humanity is always poverty and ignorance, and what the children you raise up as a society become the replacement for your civilization. If you don't care about it, if you don't teach them how to be good citizens, they're not going to be good citizens, and they're not going to want the things that good citizens want. I want to push back a little bit on the Fox News point, in part because I am a Fox News contributor, and in part because I think Fox News is wildly misunderstood by a lot of people. I agree with EJ entirely. Fox News is going through quite a transition right now, and I'm not happy at all. I was a very, very sharp critic of some of the stuff that Sean Hannity's been doing the last couple of weeks. But first of all, EJ is right. The news side is actually full of a lot of really excellent reporters, many of whom are not conservative. They're just reporters, and this is the best job. This is the job they wanted. They like what they do. They like the freedom that they have. But what also a lot of people have never understood is that Fox has never been nearly as right-wing as a lot of its critics think it is. It's always been more populist than right-wing. It has always worked on the assumption, well, an executive there once showed me what the market for Fox News was, and he put his left hand over the eastern coast of California, eastern border of California, and his right hand over the sort of western trim of New York City, and said all this stuff in the middle, that's our market. And Fox News works from a certain assumption in terms of, I'm not talking about the news part per se, but the sort of the gestalt of the network, which is that this is a good country, that these are good people, that American people are good people, that the military may make mistakes, but it's something to be honored and respected, that the police, they may make mistakes, there may be bad apples, but there's people who should be honored and respected, that this was a good and decent country and that it shouldn't be run down. Now, you may think that it's sort of invidious for me to make this point and that somehow it's wrong to suggest that the mainstream media doesn't agree with that. But that is a widespread, and I will argue, very understandable perception about a lot of the way the mainstream media has operated for the last 40 years. And just on this sort of balance thing, look, first of all, just to bolster Danielle's point a little bit, my favorite New Yorker cartoon has two dogs sitting drinking martinis in a bar in New York, and one dog in pinstripe suits, and one dog says to the other dog, you know, it's not good enough that dogs succeed. Cats must also fail. And we are living as a culture, not just a media culture, but as a culture in a moment where what I call ecstatic schadenfreude runs rampant, where it's not just the news has to help my side, it has to make you feel bad, right? And that's what the arguments on Twitter are all about. But the idea that somehow that the mainstream media or the media that EJ is touting doesn't have any double standards of its own, I just think is just flatly wrong, and I could argue about it for hours. But I'll just give one example from this week. It was reported this week that the FISA courts had to chastise brutally the Obama administration for lying to them, for misleading them while they were scooping up vast amounts of private data in this country. 1 out of 20 emails in this country was scooped up. And the New York Times, the Washington Post, the major news networks, none of them covered this. If this had happened on George W. Bush's watch, this would have been a front page, 5-alarm story about the intrusion on our civil liberties. And yet it was only covered on broadcast on a network by Fox News, at least as of last night. And it's only been covered in a handful of other outlets because it's a story that's bad for Obama and sort of distracting from Trump. And this kind of thing happens a vast amount more than I think a lot of people in the mainstream media want to credit. And it's noticed by people on the right. And when people on the right, and people, not when I mean people on the right, I mean normal Americans who make up a big chunk of this country, and when they see these double standards, it makes them lose faith and confidence in the media, and that makes it all the more hard for the media to do its job, which is to get the truth out to everybody.
I want to ask her a question about opinion news, and I do it with some trepidation when I have 3 people who write columns on this podium. But I want to. One observation is that in your lifetime as a news executive, we experience this proliferation of opinion-based journalism. And there's now a lot of news coverage, quote-unquote news coverage, that's a lot of people sitting arrayed like this, arguing their differing political perspectives on a news subject of the day, versus kind of on-the-ground reporting, which seemed to be in short supply, for instance, in coverage of the Trump campaign during the election, which led to our kind of failure to understand what was really happening with those voters. I'm wondering, as somebody who spent her career making decisions about what was covered for two of the major networks, if you can pinpoint sort of a moment in the evolution of television journalism and tell us what you think, how you think that's worked out.
Well, I just had a flashback, and this was before Fox News, when Britt Hume was working at ABC. It's a story I've never told, but I just remember this when Lonnie Guinier was, because I knew Lonnie from Radcliffe, when she was nominated, I remember Britt going on the 320, which was our internal intercom, talking about Lonnie and describing a person that I totally didn't know. But this was the narrative that was coming from the right wing. And that, for me, was one of the moments. And then Britt eventually was at Fox News. But if there is a moment, that would be a moment when I realized everyone is not necessarily trying to tell exactly the story, exactly the truth, that there is a perspective and a demonization. And I guess it's that demonization that was a turning point for me.
I want to integrate some of the questions we're getting from the audience, which are terrific. And one of them focuses on the interest currently in leaking. And the question is it a public service or a scourge? And how do you assess the ethics of a leak or of a leaker? I think we've experienced leaks in the past week that have both been, we've had two different classes of leaks. Mm-hmm. We've had the leaks to journalists, and then we've had, of course, the leaks from the Oval about security issues and conversations with other countries. But let's focus on the journalistic half of that. Are they good or bad for democracy? The president says that they're bad. EJ?
Well, I'm very pro-leak. Just,
Would you like to give your phone number?
No, I'm sorry, yeah.
Yes.
No, but I mean, let's be candid. When anybody in politics who sees a leak that hurts their side of politics, regardless of where they stand, might sometimes get angry about the leak and say, aha, this is a motivated leak. And I think the first thing that matters is the leak true? And that, during the McCarthy period, there were things that leaked that weren't true. And so I think the test number one is the leak true? Test number two is there something in this leak that genuinely endangers national security? That's a fair question to ask. If you leak military plans in advance of something the military is going to do, it is legitimate to say, no, that's not something that should be leaked. I had a personal experience of this when I was in Lebanon, and a man called William Buckley, no relation to Bill Buckley, was kidnapped. And we covered the story, and we journalists all looked at his resume, and you could just tell the guy was CIA. But none of us reported this. And we didn't report it because this guy was in trouble enough. We saw no reason to do that. Unfortunately for Mr. Buckley, the Iranians knew, the kidnappers knew that because the Iranians had discovered it when they occupied the U.S. Embassy in Iran and had put together, taken all the shredded memos and put them back together. But all of us felt a sense of responsibility. We're not going to sort of write about this aspect of the guy's life. We reported what he had done in the world, but we didn't say that. So, obviously this comes from a point of view that does see the Trump administration as potentially very dangerous to our country. And there are many different ways in which a free republic, free democratic republic, can fight back against abuses in government. And one is the courts, one is the electoral system, one is free speech through argument. But one of them is the actions of civil servants, people who work for the government, interacting with the media to report on things that they believe either undermine the official story, show the official story as a lie, or put into public discussion information that the press and the leaker believe that belief is in the public interest to do. So, to me, what Trump is doing, and it's exactly what Richard Nixon did in Watergate, although I think all comparisons of Trump to Nixon are unfair to Nixon, but that's for another day. I really do. I could actually make that case. I think they are largely using this leak business as a distraction to push the story in a different direction.
One of the, I've been obsessed in recent months with lying, and we've focused a lot of it on the White House. But I've just started asking reporters in my everyday life, tell me the first time you were lied to for a story. And we all have a story about that. And those experiences form us deeply, and I think contribute to this kind of skeptical stance, sometimes cynical, that you see in a lot of journalists. But what was remarkable to me was the lying that occurs at all levels in journalism. Man on the street interviews where somebody I talked to had interviewed somebody who gave her his boss's name instead of his own because he thought it would be funny to see that in the paper, on up through conversations with Michael Resendez at the Boston Globe about being lied to by the cardinal about sexual abuse among Catholic priests in Boston. And I'm reminded, and I've written about this recently, but I'm reminded to mention it because one of the questions from the audience is, should elected officials be more accountable for facts and for lies, for stories that they invoke? Is it different? Should we have different expectations from them than we do from journalists? One of my biases is that we don't do a good enough job of explaining when we're lied to. We kind of absorb it and try to ferret out the truth, and then when we make a mistake, it looks like a journalistic fault. But how do we balance that, and how do we manage it from a public official perspective?
Can I open with just one funny story that's not from me, but from my friend Allison Mitchell, a great New York Times journalist, and she was interviewing the Speaker of the New York State Assembly many, many years ago, and she asked him a very direct question, and he looks at her straight in the face and says, "On the record, yes. Off the record, no." And Allison just threw down her pen and said, "What the hell am I supposed to do with that?" So I just can't resist passing that on. I'll let someone take
it happens
it's a very
lot.
serious question.
It's a day in and day out,
Yeah.
I think, experience for most journalists.
Yeah, one of the reasons why I am not a reporter, I mean, I've done some reporting, I do go around, but it's mostly sort of my gimlet eye kind of stuff rather than like day-to-day political reporting, and politicians call me all the time and all that kind of thing. But one of the reasons why I don't do reporting is I cannot stand being lied to. It makes me feel like you think I'm an idiot. And I also, because I like arguments, I can't listen to people I think are saying really stupid things and say, oh, that's interesting. Oh, tell me more. And some people have that gift that they can, and I don't denigrate them for it. Some of these people are very good friends of mine. They can sit there and they'll let people hang themselves in front of them. And I'm not good at that. I just want to brawl. And, William Rusher was the longtime publisher of National Review. He always used to pull over the new kids at the magazine and he would say, look, I need to explain something to you. Politicians will always disappoint you. And the point was, particularly for young ideological and idealistic kids at National Review, is that politicians are human beings. Their incentive structure is different. They are set up to win elections and to be popular. And this is true of people on the left or on the right. It doesn't matter. It's that the politicians are human beings that journalists want to either build up or tear down, that people want to build up or tear down. And at the end of the day, they're just still made from the same crooked timber of humanity as everybody else. I agree entirely that we should have more expectations of them not to lie, but I also think that bears shouldn't use our national forests as toilets. Politicians will lie because that is what they do.
Danielle, you spent a lot of time thinking and talking and researching ethics. What is the ethical arrangement or relationship between reporters and sources?
Thanks. I'm going to put it in a slightly different way, if you don't mind, which is to say I think one has to put the issue of the problem of legitimacy, institutional legitimacy, into the conversation as well. So that is, lies undermine the credibility and authority and ultimately legitimacy of any important institution. So the leaks from civil servants are a form of whistleblowing, and that's because they don't see the legitimacy of the process that they're working in. The difficult thing then is you sort of develop a culture of leaks, and so the New York Times publication of the Manchester material, I think, was a mistake. I don't think that there was anything of public value in that publication, but I think that the culture of sort of expectation of leaking has now extended beyond places where there's a problem with the legitimacy of the process. That is, there's no reason to think that the British process is illegitimate and won't, as appropriate, be transparent about what they're learning. No reason to think that. So therefore, I think that was a mistake. So the reason I'm trying to put this concept of legitimacy together here with the sort of issue of lying is because I think one of the things that we've been living through is that a lot of institutions could protect their legitimacy through secrecy, that is, through non-disclosure in the pre-internet world, which is not, is the lie by omission, not the lie by commission, all right? You can't keep things secret anymore. And so the first instinct when that protective possibility disappeared was to move from the lie by omission, as in the case of the Catholic Church, to the lie by commission. So in that regard, I think actually one of the core problems has to do with leadership and how we teach leadership and how we teach people to think about protecting their own organization in conditions of maximal transparency. And I think that's actually a very fundamental change in people's basic habits of self-protection. So weirdly enough, I actually think in some ways we need to insist on truth and hold people to account for lies, and the electorate holds electeds accountable for lies. We need to hold people accountable there. But I actually think we have to help people rethink self-protection, because it's that, the desire for self-protection, even in conditions of maximal transparency, that is leading people into corrupt forms of behavior. And I think our anti-corruption efforts need to focus there.
We have very little time left, and I want to ask you all to give me a very short answer to a very big question. I was thinking when Lilia mentioned the 1984 Jesse Jackson campaign, and she talked about how this was really a coming of age for a lot of black journalists and an entry into political reporting for a lot of black journalists. So these moments that come and they change forever, kind of the trajectory of the industry, right? And so I guess the question is, inspired by that and by someone in the audience who says, how will the media industry change in the next decade? I'd like to hand each of you a crystal ball or a magic wand, you can take whichever, and tell us, very briefly, when another panel is assembled here under Dean Cohen some years from now and they're debating something else but looking back at this moment, what will we say changed about journalism and fact-seeking as a result of this period? EJ?
Oh, thanks a lot. This will just give me a chance to piggyback on the other point you made, which is, I was sitting here racking my brain. I do not remember being directly lied to very much face to face. I remember far more people putting spin on events, giving partial versions of events. And I actually think this moment really is different in kind in terms of outright lying that we are seeing. That it doesn't mean other politicians haven't lied. I think there is a kind of disrespect for truth altogether that's deeper, which is why that's how I'll lead into my answer to your question. I think that we'll remember this time as a time of enormous technological change, which is forcing everyone to find new ways to find audiences. It's a time of enormous economic change where what we call traditional journalism is sort of beginning again, but very slowly, to find its footing, to finance a public good. We used to finance the public good of journalism through monopoly profits that newspapers made. Those monopoly profits are gone, and so now we're trying to figure out how do you finance this public good. I think that is going to be very very important. And I'll just close with this, that I think that I truly believe the Trump period presents fundamental problems to our attitudes toward both liberty and equality, to pick up Danielle's point, and that how people stood on this, how they battled, and how they tried to tell the American people what was going on. People are going to be judged by how they behaved in this period more than in other periods of American history.
Thank you. Lelia?
So, I mean, I think we are at an existential moment. I think we were probably lulled over the last 8 years into thinking that the country could come together. I don't mean post-racially, but a different optimism. I think this is disruptive right now. I think that 20 years from now, 50 years from now, this will be seen as an aberration. At least I hope it will. I hope it doesn't, that we are not going in a direction from which we cannot come back. But I think it is the responsibility. People will ask, where were you on the side of history? I mean, one of my journalism classes, Fred Friendly was my journalism professor, and he had been at CBS during the McCarthy hearings and with Edward R. Murrow. And I think that, you know, we will look back and say, what were those hearings like? Where were people? How did they report? What were the elected officials doing?
Danielle?
I'll take the magic wand. I guess I've got 5 waves. Slightly crazy. Here we go. End the war on drugs. Reduce expenditures on criminal justice. Reinvest in education, including public universities. Work our way through our polarization to enough of a shared narrative to rebuild civic education, and thereby create a market for the PBS NewsHour.
And let it never be said that Radcliffe did not give the last word to a conservative.
The prophecies are true. So I've spent the last 2 years, pretty bad 2 years, and I've come to define hope as that brief pause between kicks to the groin. And so I'm tempted just to say buy gold, but a couple scattershot points. One, a lot of us are still in the grips of nostalgia about a certain parenthesis in American history, about this idea of objective national news that really comes basically out of the 1930s and 1940s, and then really with the rise of television. If you go back and you read the coverage of the Lincoln-Douglas debates between the Republican papers and the Democratic papers, and in the Republican version, Lincoln-Douglas was reduced to a quivering puddle of jello as he could not withstand the blinding heat of Lincoln's oratory. And then the Democratic papers were like, 12 men had to restrain Lincoln, so incensed was he to lose the argument so resoundingly. And what I would love to see is not necessarily a return to that, but a return to the idea that the most important media in people's lives is generated closer to home, that comes out of the organic community in which they live, that covers the world that they actually live in. I'm a very big believer in pushing down as much democracy to the lowest level possible, because that's how it is the best way to maximize the happiness of the most people. And the last point I'll make is that the written word ain't going away. They keep pronouncing it dead, and yet it endures. And the secret, as any good television producer will tell you, is that the written word still drives television, because where people learn about what's going on is from newspapers and magazines and now from screens, but someone still had to write it down first. And that is a glorious and wonderful thing, because it might keep me employed.
Thank you, and please just join me again in thanking all of our panelists, EJ, Alelia, Danielle, and Jonah. Thanks so much.
So, Let me add my thanks to the panelists for really a very thoughtful and terrific conversation, and to the audience for your great questions, and again to Anne Marie for guiding the discussion so expertly.